This time it's 5 even more engineering disasters. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. It seems failure has many faces. Bad luck, bad design, bad engineering, or badly put together. Sometimes a perfectly good bike doesn't do very well, and sometimes a not very good bike does pretty well. Here's 5 more engineering disasters. Kawasaki Zx10 appeared in the mid-80s. They used a massively powerful engine, and the styling looked very much like the later ZZR range. This was a powerful sports tourer in the vein of the later Blackbird and the Hayabusa, and although the bike was pretty much bulletproof, there was one issue that damaged the bike's reputation, and the issue was very much around carb icing. Essentially, the bike would cough, splutter and spit the rider off. Well, that's at least what some of the riders who owned them and had accidents on them claimed. The thing was, the bike was immensely powerful by the standards of the time, and whilst bad fueling and spluttering wouldn't be a huge problem on, say, a 125, it's a mighty big problem on a machine like the ZX10. Again, these problems severely damaged the bike's reputation at the time, and people began to see the machine as something of a death trap. To their credit, Kawasaki did respond and developed a carb de-icing kit which was fitted to the bikes retrospectively. But as with so many machines before, once the reputation is damaged, sales never do seem to recover, even if you fix the problem. This was a bike that was great at eating up motorway miles. Unfortunately, that's exactly when the carb icing issues could occur, particularly in places like Britain and in Northern Europe, where the air was cold and damp. On the bright side, it does make ZX10s fairly inexpensive to buy these days, and the problem should have been fixed long ago. The TT600 was Triumph's first tilt at the mass market. It used a 600cc 4-cylinder engine. The 600 market was huge at that time, and Triumph decided they wanted a piece of the action. I've owned one of these machines, and I can say it actually was a really good bike. It was relatively comfortable, it handled fantastically, and the brakes were extremely good. But those weren't the areas that killed the bike off. Where the bike failed was in essentially 2 areas. For some people the styling was just too frumpy, but the big issue was in the engine department, and more specifically the fueling. This was the first 600cc machine to use fuel injection. This was a brave, and as it turned out, slightly foolhardy move by Triumph at the time. When the bike was released, the fueling was somewhat less than perfect, and there were a number of flat spots, particularly low down. Triumph, to their credit, did produce remaps of the fuel injection system, and in later models, new camshafts and some other redesign work completely ironed the problem out. My 2002 model produced beautiful linear power all the way up, but as with so many of the machines in this list, once the reputation is damaged, it pretty much stays damaged. And unfortunately, the TT600 was not the sales success that Triumph were hoping for. This is a great pity because all round I have to say it's an extremely good bike and deserved much better. If I were to mention 1970s MV Augustas, I bet you're going to think straight away about the 754 cylinder bikes. I'd think about those too. But there were other machines produced. MV in fact did produce quite a large range of relatively small capacity bikes throughout their history, the 350S being notable as one of them. This used an overhead valve parallel twin edge in a very nice, well-developed chassis. But as usual with MV, there were problems. Build quality was not really up to scratch, chrome tended to fall off. The electrics were poor, to put it mildly. But the biggest problem of all was the engine. The engine did produce good power for its capacity by the standards of the time, of course, but it also vibrated horribly and didn't run very well, and wasn't particularly reliable when used aggressively. And to cap it all, it was bloody expensive too. Offsetting this was the great chassis and very beautiful design. This is a great looking little bike, it's just not a particularly good one. In the end though, the name on the badge guarantees that this bike will sell for a big sum when it comes up onto the market. Yamaha's Xs750 ran between 1976 and 1981. When it first appeared, it was voted Motorcycle News Bike of the Year, just as the Norton Commando had been several years before. The machine was a 3-cylinder triple, rather like Triumph's T150 or T160 Tridents. But this machine used double overhead cams, the bike had a 5-speed gearbox and shaft drive. This made the machine much more sophisticated than the Triumph had been, and the looks were much fresher and much more modern. Unfortunately, the bike was never the great sales success that Yamaha had hoped it would be. Some early bikes suffered oil supply issues. This affected the top end wear and also affected cooling. Yamaha would cure these problems, particularly in the later 850 models, which were much improved. Another problem in the 76 models was that they used points, and these would wear fairly rapidly. This would be cured in 78 when Yamaha introduced electronic ignition to the bike. But the biggest problem that dogged the bike was its transmission. The clutch was grabby and felt unsophisticated when compared to its 4-cylinder rivals from the other Japanese companies. And the gearbox also was rather clunky, so it felt a little bit like a BMW or Motor Guzzi at the time. And again, this meant that it felt somewhat crude compared to its siblings from the other Japanese companies. The bike was simply not the success that Yamaha were hoping for. The bike did sell reasonably well as a niche model because of its shaft drive, making it a very popular tourer, but ultimately it had slightly poorer performance than the 4-cylinder bikes from the other Japanese manufacturers, and this dampened sales success. A later 850 model was introduced in 1980. This improved on many of the issues that had dogged the earlier bikes, but it was never the huge success that Yamaha had hoped for. And in the end, they would adapt 4 cylinders just like everybody else. Although it's an interesting footnote to see that Yamaha have reintroduced 3 cylinders into their range in recent years. Although of course these are now chain drive, it seems that Yamaha wouldn't go to the expense or trouble of putting shaft drive on their newer machines. Sunbeam was originally set up by John Marsden and was one of the great old companies of the early motorcycle era. However, by the 1930s, the company was lagging behind and was in financial trouble. Quite simply, its machines had a reputation for fine build quality and elegance, but their designs were somewhat outdated by this period. The motorcycle division was bought up by Associated Motorcycles in the early 30s. These would go on to produce a range of single-cylinder machines which were of quite nice design actually, just before World War II. However, when the war started, and in the interwar years, AMC sold the company and the name over to BSA. And that's really where the story begins. The story goes that BSA were offered the rights to BMW's Boxer twins after World War II as war reparations. Now, although they did take the Bantam, they weren't really interested in producing a replica of BMW's Boxers. Instead, they got Ealing Pope to design a completely new design, although along similar lines. What he designed was essentially a very interesting machine. It was an inline twin as opposed to a parallel twin, with a 4-speed gearbox, dry clutch and shaft drive. A lot of the details of the machines did in many ways mimic BMWs of the period and of the interwar years, so it was clearly inspired by them. And much of the design today would look familiar to anybody who's a fan of bobber machines, but there were a number of issues with this bike. Early prototypes of the machines were sent over to South Africa for a royal visit to be used as escort vehicles. It was found that the bikes vibrated horrendously. Taking the advice on board, BSA rubber mounted the engine and the frame. This meant that a flexible joint had to be fed into the exhaust to stop it cracking. But it did at least cure most of the vibration issues. But another big problem was the drive shaft. They initially wanted to design a fairly conventional BMW-like final drive system, but they ran into trouble with BMW, somewhat ironically, when they fell foul of BMW copyright. This meant they had to completely redesign the back final drive system. This used a worm drive, and the worm drive had a tendency to overheat and rapidly wear out. The team struggled to try and fix this problem, but in the end they had no option but to detune the bike. In the end, the final production bikes made only around 25 horsepower, which even by that time was a fairly modest production for a 500 twin. In the end, what we got was a modestly performing, sedate gentleman's conveyance, if you like. And this simply didn't fit in with the post-war era riders' attitude to motorcycles. Ultimately, everybody wanted something a bit more sporty, and people went out and bought sporty Triumph 500s or BSAs or Nortons, and they didn't buy Sunbeams in sufficient numbers to justify continued production. A slightly more lively, well at least lively looking version, the S8 would also come into production. This used more BSA parts, dispensed the balloon tyres and looked a little bit more sleek. But this wasn't successful either, and in the end this very nice little design faded away after only a few years. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. And of course, thanks for watching.